global engagement. I know many of you, but not all of you, so I would love to have a chance to get to know those of you who are new. Thank you for coming today. The event this afternoon is part of International Education Week, and you should notice lots of emails, posters, exhortations to participate with us this week as we celebrate both our international community, students, faculty, staff, community members, and also all the incredible global work that goes on at the university. And so between those two things, we encompass a tremendous amount of the scope of the University of Wyoming. And those of you who've heard me speak before have heard me say that we are a global university. It is what makes us great, and it's events like this today that help us engage with what's happening far outside the boundaries of our town. So International Education Week is co-sponsored by the Department of State and the Department of Education. It's a nationwide event where universities all across the country, and not just here, do what we're doing. So we have everything from themed drinks in the cafe over in Ross Hall to incredible lectures to presentations by students about the places they come from and the research they're doing. So please keep a lookout for those announcements and join us for the whole gamut of things we have going. One of the amazing units that I have the privilege of supervising is the Center for Global Studies. And so it's my great privilege right now to tell you a little bit about what CGS does and to introduce its director. So the Center for Global Studies sponsors the entire gamut of research globally that we do engage in and hope to engage in, both for students and faculty, and also works very hard to develop intellectual community on campus among people who are interested in global issues, do work outside the United States, or do work to bring international issues to our campus. And Dr. Caroline McCracken-Flesher is a tireless advocate of international research, and we are so fortunate to have her. So first, before I even introduce her, I'm just going to ask everybody to give her a little round of applause for all she does. And yes, thank you. Great, Marco in the back. We're very fortunate to have here in the Wild Global team. Makes everything work and tells the great stories about all we do. So thank you, Greg. And really, that's all for me. I'm going to turn it over to Caroline to introduce our panel today and maybe talk a little bit more about CGS and International Education Week. So thank you all very much for being here and for supporting the global work that we do as a great global university. Thanks.
So I'm just going to mention that those of you who had the opportunity to go to the Breezeway at lunchtime got to see a lot of the student work that happens as a result of the support of faculty, the mentorship of faculty, and the support of donors that sends them all over the world with some really terrific posters. We'll hope to share them with you again. But I want to move on to the main event today, which is Ambassador Tom Wall Ambassador Marc Wall in conversation with some of our faculty. I began my day with an external board meeting for a completely unrelated organization. And as things went on and we got deep into the budget, people started to yell at one another. And the rest of us tried to sit at the table. So I'm now happy to be ending my day with a lesson in conciliation. The University of Wyoming is remarkable for faculty who are accomplished academics and also practitioners. Our program today is going to draw in 3 such colleagues in addition to Ambassador Marc Wall. Dr. Ann Alexander from the Department of Economics is the past director of international programs. That's just one of the many really significant administrative roles she's played at UW. But she's also served as a resources economist in the U.S. Department of State. Dr. Jean Garrison, School of Politics, Public Affairs, and International Studies, is the founding director of the Center for Global Studies. Thank you, Jean. She has served in the Office of Chinese and Mongolian Affairs in the U.S. State Department. And retired Ambassador Tom Dougherty is also a past CEO of Fulbright Australia and a visiting professor at UW. So we are remarkably privileged privileged and fortunate in our faculty. Here to get them all stirred up or calmed down is Ambassador Marc Wall, and we're going to lead, just to give you a sense of how the afternoon will proceed, we'll go to lead with Marc Wall's talk, then Tom Dougherty will respond, and then Anne Alexander and Jean Garrison will lead us all in a broader discussion. So get your concerns, your challenges, and your questions ready. And now let me turn to Anne Alexander to introduce her colleague and friend, Ambassador Marc Wall.
Well, I have a phone from which to read my script, but also some personal commentary here, so that will not be embarrassing at all. Marc Wall, Ambassador retired, served a nearly 4-decade career in the U.S. Foreign Service. After earning a bachelor's in European history from Princeton and a master's from Columbia University School of International Affairs, he served in the U.S. Department of State in a large variety of roles. Including coordinating reconstruction programs in Iraq, managing trade initiatives with Japan, China, and Taiwan, and serving in various postings from Zimbabwe to Cote d'Ivoire. He has served as an advisor to the U.S. Pacific Command in Hawaii, and he was the U.S. Ambassador to the Republic of Chad, appointed by President George W. Bush. His Foreign Service work also entailed several teaching fellowships at Georgetown, the City University of New York, or City College of New York, and the National Defense University. He also spent time with us here at UW as a visiting scholar in global and area studies. And I would just say that I was privileged to be able to work for Marc when I was at the State Department. I was on a AAAS S&T fellowship, which meant that I got to go work in the State Department and learn how policy is made. And Marc was the incoming director, I believe, of the economic policy staff, upon which I was posted. And when I got there, my experience with having a supervisor was pretty limited because we're academics, right? And so I was sort of a little trepidatious about what that looked like. But from Marc, I learned not only about diplomacy and conflict resolution, but good leadership. Good leadership is not about titles, authority, control. Good leadership is about curiosity, listening, and always surrounding yourself with really good people. So it was a real privilege to get to work with him and learn from him during that year. So without further ado, Ambassador Marc Wall, please come to the podium.
Thank you so much, my friend and former colleague, Anne. You say that you worked in my office. I may have been your boss, but as I mentioned earlier today, you were actually my teacher. So you didn't quite get out of academia. But thank you, Caroline McCracken-Flesher, for inviting me here. It's so good to see friends and former colleagues here at UW, most particularly Dr. Jean Garrison, who I worked with so closely in the year that I spent here. I really am so pleased to be back at UW. I did spend a wonderful year as a senior visiting scholar here, teaching and traveling around the state, giving talks. So I have very, very fond memories of being here at UW, and it's really great to be back. So you've chosen a really interesting theme for this symposium, the role of the global mediator, and in the thick of it. So I thought I'd talk with you a bit about some of my experiences, because this is really, it's a very timely and important theme. Because American diplomats are deeply engaged, right, almost as we speak, in trying to broker ceasefires between Israel and Hamas in Gaza and Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon. They've also been working hard to try to reach a deal to end the awful violence that's taking place now in Western Sudan. And despite their effort, they so far have little to show for it. And in the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, the United States hasn't even tried to serve as a mediator, at least not yet. It hasn't always been this way. I mean, I well remember Henry Kissinger's, Secretary of State Kissinger's shuttle diplomacy in 1974 that led to the disengagement agreement between Israel and Egypt. There was the President Carter's hosting of the summit at Camp David, where Israel and Egypt reached a peace treaty. This was in 1979. Richard Holbrooke brokered the Dayton Peace Accord that ended the war in Bosnia in 1995. And I was in Northern Ireland this summer, and I saw the results of the peace agreement that former Senator George Mitchell managed to bring about, that produced the Good Friday Agreement and ended the violence in Northern Ireland in 1998. So during my years as a U.S. Foreign Service officer, I had a handful of opportunities to play the role of a mediator. Though my experiences were on a much, much smaller scale than the examples I just mentioned. I'd like to tell you about some of those experiences and some of the lessons I learned. But I'd also like to share with you some thoughts about the standoff between China and Taiwan and the role of the United States, the role it's played, and I hope will continue to play in preventing that standoff from collapsing into a great power conflict. So let's start with me in a hotel lobby in 1983 in the town of Bulawayo, in the southwest corner of the new country of Zimbabwe in southern Africa. I see Paddington is here from Zimbabwe, so I hope you'll appreciate what I have to say about my experience in your country way back in 1983. So I was there. I was in Bulawayo to meet businesses, to learn about opportunities for American companies. But what really interested me was learning about reports we were getting about violent clashes that were taking place in the countryside around Bulawayo. So in the embassy in Harare, we were starting to get reports about Zimbabwean soldiers on the rampage and engaged in mass executions. Zimbabwe had become an internationally recognized sovereign country only a few years before. Before that, it was known as Rhodesia. The white settlers who controlled the government had declared their independence from Great Britain in 1965. And in the 70s, an insurrection sprang up among the black majority African peoples against white minority rule. After a very bloody war, the United Kingdom, with help from the United States, brokered a peace deal that established a black majority government. We and the UK had a lot invested in the success of that new government. South Africa was just to the south of Zimbabwe and still under apartheid rule. And we thought if a multiracial democracy could take root in Zimbabwe, it could become a model for peaceful transition in South Africa, or that's what we hoped. The problem was the coalition between the two former rebel groups had broken down. And by the time I was in that lobby in Bulawayo in 1983, the smaller faction had been booted out from the cabinet and its leader driven into exile. And what made the political conflict between the two factions worse was its roots in an ethnic conflict between them. Early in the 19th century, the Zulu nation of South Africa had imploded in civil war, and one of the main splinter groups had moved into what became the southwestern part of Zimbabwe. These were the Ndebele people. They were much better organized and more warlike than the Shona people, who occupied much of the region. And the invaders ruled the Shona with an iron hand until the British settlers started arriving in the 1890s and imposed their rule. So with the coming of independence under black majority rule, these ethnic tensions spewed over. The Shona people had the big majority in the new government, and having been suppressed for so long when the Ndebele people dominated, now they had the upper hand, the Shona people had the upper hand, and they weren't slow to take revenge. And this was the context that I found myself in Bulawayo in the spring of 1983. It wasn't possible for me to make the rounds around town to call on people, so I held most of my meetings in the hotel lobby. And I heard some horrific stories about arrests and executions and revenge killings. And so when I got back to the embassy, I did what diplomats do, and I sent reports into Washington about what I'd heard. So we and other Western diplomats did what we could to urge the regime in Harare to stop the violence against civilians. But we weren't in a position to interject ourselves directly in efforts to settle the conflict. Still, it did bring home to me certain lessons about mediation. First, talk to people, listen to them, learn from them the forces driving conflict, because those struggles among personalities are at the forefront. Behind the political tensions lie deep economic, ethnic, and religious divisions. And mediation cannot succeed if those forces are not understood. Okay, let's fast forward some 17 years to a very different place and to a very different problem. I'm in a back room of an Italian restaurant in downtown Taipei in Taiwan. I'm hosting a dinner for representatives of Micron, a major U.S. semiconductor manufacturer, and the head of the Taiwan Semiconductor Association. I had invited them because each side had accused the other of dumping their semiconductors in each other's market. Micron claimed that Taiwan factories were dumping or selling chips in the U.S. market at below production costs. And Taiwan claimed that Micron was doing the same thing in Taiwan's markets. And Taiwan claimed that that Micron was doing that in Taiwan. So the two sides had filed anti-dumping cases before their respective agencies. So this mattered to both Taiwan and to us. Taiwan had already become a powerhouse in chip manufacturing. We were deep in negotiations on Taiwan's accession to the World Trade Organization. This was the most important international group that Taiwan was eligible to join as a non-state member. Negotiations on China's WTO accession were also going forward. And we needed to have Taiwan's accession package ready before China's accession was in place. Our negotiations with Taiwan had already succeeded in resolving many of the problems we had doing business in Taiwan. But these dueling anti-dumping cases threatened to derail the whole process. So there I was in this Italian restaurant in Taipei, hoping that I could get the two sides talking over a pleasant dinner. I wasn't sure how it was going to turn out. There were a lot of hard feelings between them. The lead guest on the Taiwan side was the head of the Semiconductor Industry Association. I had met him a few months before on a visit to a city where most of Taiwan's chips were made. He was a Princeton-educated electrical engineer very, very competent, soft-spoken, but also determined not to give in on this case. On the Micron side was a very, very tough trade lawyer. Neither was he about to let anyone take advantage of his client. So our talk over dinner went very stiffly at first, but gradually the wine and the pasta helped loosen everyone up. And then Micron's marketing representative floated an idea. Micron was a leading member of an international research consortium on semiconductor technology, and he suggested bringing Taiwan semiconductor companies into the group, and that broke the ice. So the dinner didn't solve our problems. There was a lot more back and forth to go through. Those of us working on the WTO talks, both in Taipei and in Washington, we encouraged the two sides as best we could to figure out a way to find a solution to their dispute. And in the end, they did. The dueling anti-dumping cases were withdrawn, and the dispute did not end up derailing our trade relations or the WTO accession negotiations. So from this experience, I learned how important it is to bring the two sides together and try to get them talking. How important sometimes talking can be facilitated by avoiding courtrooms and legal proceedings and formal meetings. How it can take time for discussions to ripen into agreement. How sometimes a fresh idea can open a path to agreement, and how relationships matter. The head of the Taiwan Association was skeptical about accepting my invitation to dinner. But because we had met before and knew each other, he did accept the invitation. And I think we trusted each other to be honest go-betweens between our two sides. Okay. That was Taipei in about 1999 or 2000. I'm going to fast forward again 7 years to a very, very different place and a very different set of issues. So I'm in a dusty compound in the town of Abushe. It's in the desert in eastern Chad, near the border with Sudan. I'm there with Andrew Natsios. He was President George W. Bush's special envoy for peace talks in Sudan. And my team and I had organized a meeting for him with representatives of the rebel factions in the war raging across the border in Darfur in Sudan. So a rebellion had broken out in that part of western Sudan about 4 years before. The various black African ethnic groups were fighting for more say over their own affairs. They were not respected or represented in the main government in Khartoum. So 4 years before, they had started attacking Sudanese military bases, and the government in Khartoum had retaliated. The Sudanese forces counterattacked by bombing villages and by organizing and supplying ethnic Arab militias called Janjaweed, which means devils on horseback in Arabic. So these gangs would raid villages, burn them to the ground, slaughter the men and boys, rape women, kill the livestock, and hundreds of thousands of civilians had fled across the border and were living in refugee camps in Chad. So Washington had determined that genocide was taking place. And President Bush vowed that genocide would not happen on his watch. Almost every month, I would escort congressional delegations, film crews, movie stars to visit the camps in eastern Chad. And among these groups were then Senator Obama and later then Senator Biden. Now, the previous April, we had helped cut a peace deal between Khartoum and the rebel groups, but only one of the breakaway factions had signed it. So until then, we in the embassy in Chad had worked hard to stay in contact with all the rebel representatives. And after that agreement was reached the previous April, however, we were told to stop talking to those groups that did not sign the agreement. I thought that was a mistake, but those were our orders. But by January of 2007, it was obvious that the peace deal wasn't holding, so we were told to reverse course and get all the factions together in one place to meet our special presidential envoy. At first, the Chadian government was reluctant to let us do that because it was trying to patch things up with the government in Sudan, and it didn't want to be seen to be too close to the Sudanese rebel groups. But finally, they did authorize us to meet the Sudanese rebel groups on Chadian territory in the town of Abushe. Now, getting the various factions to assemble there was like herding cats. They had a common cause, which was ending the ethnic violence that Khartoum had unleashed in Darfur. But otherwise, these groups were completely divided. We had to call in all our chips to get them there. But finally, all the meetings that I had had with them in my living room, my calls on them in their compounds, my visits with them on my trips to eastern Chad, all this finally bore fruit, and we got them together. We got them there in one place and spent the day in talks. And later that evening, I got a call from one of the most militant of the groups and was told that it would do something we had been asking them to do. They agreed that they would commit publicly to renounce any intention of seeking the overthrow of the regime in Khartoum. Now, as hard as we worked to end the violence in Darfur, in the end, we too had little to show for our efforts. So the violence in Darfur has continued, and today, even after our meetings in Abushe and all the other efforts that have gone into a peace settlement in that region, the situation's even worse. So this reminds me of something that has been attributed to former Secretary of State James Baker. He was talking about the negotiations between Israel and Palestine. He said that we can't want peace more than the parties do. And this is certainly the case for us in Darfur. You know, sometimes mediators have carrots and sticks that they can use to get the parties to reach agreement. But mediators cannot impose agreement. The parties involved have to want it as well. But another lesson I take away from this is the importance of having relationships with all parties around the table. That was the only reason we were able to organize the gathering in Abushe. It's because we had, over many months, had cultivated relationships with everyone involved. They knew us and we knew them. And we in the embassy did not favor one side and did not seek to exclude another side. So what this tells me is a mediator needs to have the confidence of all sides to be a mediator. Okay, I'm going to switch to another broader theme. I'd actually like to talk about another experience I had in mediation when working with Japan after the earthquake and Fukushima nuclear disaster in 2011. But Professor Garrison is about to put the time card up. So I'm going to move on to talk about the issue between China and Taiwan, where I also, countries where, or places where I also spent much of my career. The two sides remain locked in a dispute over Taiwan's status. Is Taiwan an intrinsic part of China, as Beijing states, Or is it an autonomous political entity or even a sovereign state, as some and many in Taipei believe? China insists that Taiwan's unification be based on its model of one country, two systems. Taiwan refuses to accept this, and this disagreement makes the Taiwan Strait maybe the most dangerous flashpoint in the world today. Now, the United States has played a decisive role in keeping the peace between China and Taiwan for some 7 decades. The United States hasn't done that by acting directly as a mediator, but rather by a policy that balances military deterrence with political reassurance. The policy is based on 2 planks. One, the One China policy, a principle articulated in the Shanghai Communique of 1972, released during the visit of President Nixon, a visit that began the normalization of U.S.-China relations. The other plank in our policy is the Taiwan Relations Act of 1979. That law was passed in reaction to President Carter's move to sever official ties with Taiwan and extend diplomatic relations to Beijing. So the strategy outlined in the One China policy and the Taiwan Relations Act is full of ambiguity. We don't claim that Taiwan is part of China, but we recognize that the people on both sides of the Taiwan Strait do. Now, it would be a stretch to say that now, because not many in Taiwan would say Taiwan is part of China, but we could say that then. And we also said that we don't have a position on how the 2 sides resolve their differences, but whatever the settlement they might eventually reach, we want it to be achieved peacefully. We are not obligated under our law to intervene to defend Taiwan if China attacks, but we do state that coercion by China against Taiwan would threaten peace and stability in the region and be of grave concern to the United States. Now, what does this mean? What does it mean for how the United States would act in the event of a contingency between Taiwan and China? We would react for sure, but in what way and how far would we go? The uncertainties, how we would answer those questions, is what lies behind our policy, our notion of so-called strategic ambiguity. We don't say that we would defend Taiwan under any circumstance, because that could embolden Taiwan to act in ways that would provoke an attack by China. But nor do we say we won't defend Taiwan, because that too could invite China to attack. What we want to maintain the status quo. Taiwan is neither formally independent nor a province of China. That situation has prevailed for years and has benefited Taiwan enormously. It's evolved from a one-party police state into a thriving, prosperous democracy. It effectively governs itself. It functions in practice as an independent country. Though some in Taipei have been tempted to challenge that status quo, most Taiwan people, I believe now, don't want to disrupt that status quo. Now, Beijing is not happy with this, and it has kept the military pressure on and remains determined eventually to achieve unification. But so far, it's been willing to tolerate the situation. The United States has bolstered this status quo by continuing to support Taiwan's ability to defend itself. It sells Taiwan arms, it trains its troops, we have extensive unofficial ties. We don't have an embassy in Taipei, but we have an office that functions like one. When tensions flare up, we warn China not to use force, But as a gesture of reassurance to China, we also remind China that we support the idea of one China, even if that idea of one China is essentially a diplomatic fiction. But we also reiterate that we don't support Taiwan's independence. The problem now, I think, is that both China and we are tilting the balance in our policies and in our rhetoric too far toward deterrence and away from reassurance. Voices in each country, in the US and China, speak of Taiwan as being at the core of an existential conflict we have with each other. China more and more insists on a kind of a shotgun marriage with Taiwan. Marry me or else. It's intensifying its military exercising around town. It's staging more live fire drills. It's cracking down on Taiwan businesses. It's amplifying its disinformation campaigns. But the US policy also appears to be shifting. President Biden has said several times, without qualification, that the US would defend Taiwan. He's implied that the US would no longer oppose Taiwan's independence. The visit by former Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, the third in line to the president, was a real red flag to Beijing. And there's a view growing in Washington that we shouldn't just manage our competition with China. We need to win it, whatever that means. I'm not sure how you win a great competition with a great power like China. And there are voices that are also arguing that Taiwan is a strategic ally of the United States and should be defended at all costs. Now, these claims tell Beijing that the United States would never tolerate unification, even if the two sides could someday agree to that peacefully. So it's hard to guess what our next president will do. He's claimed on the campaign trail that Taiwan isn't paying us enough for our help. It's claimed that Taiwan has destroyed our semiconductor manufacturing industry. But he's also apparently staffing his administration with China hawks who want to get even tougher with Beijing. So we'll have to see how all this plays out. But for my part, I'd like to see less strategic clarity and get back to more strategic ambiguity in our relations with Taiwan. I'd like to see more expressions of political reassurance while we also continue our work to boost Taiwan's military capabilities. Otherwise, I fear that we're sleepwalking into a violent conflict with China, and that would be a disaster for us all. Okay, those are my 2 cents. 2 cents about my experiences, 2 cents about what I think is the big issue facing anyone engaged in mediation today, and that is dealing with the potential flashpoint of conflict in the Taiwan Strait. Good. Thank you all.
Well, I'm really happy to be here for a couple of reasons, but the biggest reason is that Marc Wall is here. I met Marc very briefly in Iraq in 2009, and he gave me some very good advice on his way out. He made it. He survived it pretty well as I was going in. But I'd already known a whole lot about Marc. But before then, from his reputation in Africa, where I was also serving, also at a time where the United States was playing an important mediating role. I was in the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, at the same time. Marc was working on Darfur and Sudan-related issues. Marc's reputation also in economic affairs is pretty legendary in the State Department. And although I had never served in the East Asia Pacific area, I did later, and then realized just how expensive Marc's work in that area had been done. So it'll be nice when we have a discussion period to perhaps get into a little bit more of that. I'm only going to speak for a couple of minutes because then Doctors Garrison and Alexander are going to join with Marc and with me, and I think Q&As is probably going to be the most interesting. But a couple of things struck me in Marc's presentation, which I found really, really very interesting. And I think particularly when Marc started saying in 1983, starting in Bulawayo in Zimbabwe, and then examples through the 90s. So for the benefit of students that haven't heard the term as often as those who aren't students and may remember it, but it seems a long time ago. During that period, especially from 1989 with the fall of the Berlin Wall and on, in terms of mediation, in terms of importance in the world, in terms of the role that America played, we were the indispensable nation. It was a term that Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, both at her time at the UN and then as Secretary of State, emphasized and re-emphasized over and over again. In retrospect, I mean, there may have been a tinge of overreach, maybe even arrogance on our part, but very definitely in the 90s, the role of the United States as a mediator, and a mediator that had the trust and the confidence, as Marc had said, of other parties, was really, really very important. Marc gave some great examples, 2 or 3 others that I can think of that I was just involved in the 1990s as well, were very delicate negotiations that were done by the Deputy Secretary of State Stroke Talbot during the end of the Clinton administration, when India and Pakistan were really on the verge of a nuclear war, as it emerged that Pakistan had developed nuclear weapons. I was also serving in Europe and got dragooned happily into being present at the negotiations led by Secretary Albright as Yugoslavia was breaking up, on Kosovo, on Serbia, on Bosnia, on Montenegro, where Madeleine Albright really spearheaded in the same way that Richard Holbrooke had done in the Yugoslavian peace accords, the Dayton peace accords in the first place, by bringing people together. In fact, she locked everybody up in a very nice chateau in France, which sounded like it'd be a lot of fun, but there's a reason that walls and moats are around chateaus that are medieval, and it was nobody is leaving until we get this sorted out. And more or less, she managed to sort it out. Marc mentioned Zimbabwe in 1983, when things were really starting to go very wrong. I was in Malawi in 2001, and I mention this date in particular because I think this is kind of a watershed date at a time where the United States, the global community, but most particularly countries in Southern Africa itself, had really gotten together to stop the excesses of the Mugabe administration. There was a lot of pressure by SADC, with mediation from the United States and others, to rein in Mugabe. That was happening in September of 2001. And I think it probably would have proceeded very differently, except for the fact that other events took place in September of 2001. And maybe that's the point that I would just like to emphasize as we move into a panel discussion. We talk a lot about the role of the United States as a mediator, but we haven't given a whole lot of good examples in the 21st century. And I think it would be really important to look at the reasons why that might be the case, why we're not in a role where we're mediating peace successfully, at least in the Middle East right now, why we haven't played a role yet in Russia, Ukraine, or in others. And I think a lot of it is a byproduct of 2 things. Fallout from 9/11 and the repercussions of the forever wars in Iraq and in Afghanistan that clearly did not turn out the way that we wanted. And I think secondly, the fluctuation in American foreign policy on a lot of issues, which makes the rest of the world, after 9/11, maybe not having the confidence as they have as the United States as an honest, credible broker pre-Iraq. But at the same time, the fluctuations in policy that we're in on climate, no, we're not on climate. We're going to pivot to Asia. Oh, no, we're not. We're pulling out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It's eroded the United States' role as a global mediator. But I think everyone in this room and on the world stage realize that that role needs to be recreated, needs to be reestablished. It can only be done, as Marc pointed out, by establishing relations, trust, and confidence. And I think going forward, those are the things that we're going to be needing to look forward to. So at this point, I'd like to invite fellow panelists up and entertain questions.
Actually, I'm going to take the prerogative of the moderator. Ann and I are both going to maybe pose a couple of questions. So Ann, I'll pose one, and then maybe you'll pose one back after that. So the United States, I think across both of your comments, you talked about the importance of the United States, you used the essential partner. I wondered if you would talk a little bit about the status of our alliances and how important they are in the context of a mediating role. And then if you might finish up by saying, what opportunities do you see? Is there an opportunity out there for the United States to be, having a much more robust role? And actually, Ann, would you like to start us off on this one? Or do you want to throw it to Marc?
I think I would like to have the experts talk about it, quite frankly. But I think it was your comments, Tom, were just so spot on. And Marc, you said this something very similar in my class earlier today, that we had been seen as this essential partner, and that we were indispensable. And that also, in addition to sort of the changes in the 21st century, there's also this sort of sense that we have potentially not, I don't really know exactly where I was going with that. There's a shifting role in our place in the world. We've seen an erosion of trust, but we've also seen, I think, an interesting sort of whiplash, as you pointed out, Tom, between administrations, and it's not just Trump does this or Trump does that. It has been very pervasive. And earlier in my class, Marc, you pointed out that for a good portion of your career, there was this sense in the presidency that we belonged and that we needed to bring together the world's democracies, and that we needed to have that position, and that had slowly sort of eroded over the past 10 or 15 years. And so now that I've said all that, you can talk now that you've collected your thoughts, because I clearly didn't.
I'm not so sure about that.
And you set it up well.
Tom, I appreciate the point you made, because when I was thinking about, the examples I gave of big successes when the U.S. played a role as a mediator, those were all in the 70s and 80s and 90s. And I've been trying to think, what big successes have we had since then? Which is the point you made. Why is that? I mean, I can trot out a couple of thoughts about why we're not quite able to play or playing the role that we did before. One is we had the carrots and sticks to wield, certainly with the in the Middle East in the 1970s, with the disengagement agreements in '74 and the Camp David Accord in '79. I think I have my dates right. So we not only had carrots and sticks to use, but we also had the political will to use them. I'm not sure we quite have either right now, at least in the Middle East. The other thing that might be different now than prevailed in the last part of the last century is that there are so many more players in the game. More and more countries rise in standing in the world, they are increasingly involved in various conflicts and disputes around the world. Certainly, in the current iteration of the conflict in Sudan, the big players really do not include the United States or Europe. The major players are Turkey and Egypt and the UAE and Qatar. They're the ones who are kind of egging on the conflict and taking different sides. And Russia, too, as it has bulldozed its way into the world stage. It is increasingly involved in fomenting some of these conflicts. So it's even more difficult to try to make peace now. If it ever was easy before, it's certainly not easy now. But Jean, to respond to your question, there might be one exception to how we, the United States, have been able to successfully mediate a dispute, and that is between our two treaty allies in East Asia, Korea and Japan. We've been working on this for a long time to get the two parties to bury the hatchet and work together with us on strengthening our alliance network in Asia. And President Biden hosted a summit meeting of the leaders of Korea and Japan not too long ago. And we've got a process going where those two former antagonists, though also our allies, but our former antagonists, are working together on a number of promising projects. Now, I'm not sure that our mediation made all the difference. I think really what made the difference was the way China is acting more aggressively and more assertively, and the way China and the way Japan and Korea are increasingly worried about that. So they're turning to us, and they're also turning to each other to build up our alliance against China's increasing role in the region. China is also having a lot of other impacts in the way of leading towards our role in Asia. I'm thinking of AUKUS, the Australia, Britain, U.S. agreement to build nuclear submarines. I'm thinking of the Quad, the agreement among India, Japan, the U.S. and Australia to cooperate and come together on projects to advance economic and other developments and security cooperation in Asia. So I guess I'll end there, and I think Tom will have more to say.
Yeah, I agree very strongly in terms of successes or potential successes that the Quad and AUKUS, are really important developments. Mark had said something I agree with strongly. A lot of different players have come in as mediators, and that's not always a bad thing. Sometimes that's a really good thing. Not necessarily so in the last 10, 15 years, but when you think about it in terms of Ukraine and Russia, for example, the lead negotiators on when there might have been some sort of start to an agreement was not the United States. It was Israel and Turkey. As Mark pointed out, Turkey's playing a very important regional and beyond role in a lot of areas. When Hamas and Israel dispute broke out, it was Qatar that we pretty much deferred to until just a little while ago, when Qatar said that they were kind of fed up with dealing with Hamas as well. Mark had mentioned Russia. When we look at the power vacuum that's left in Libya and the surrounding area, yeah, Russia's playing an important role. Not a good one, not a positive one, but other countries, Egypt, Turkey, for example, as well. So a lot of others. China made overtures to see if they could help broker some sort of agreement in Ukraine. But the absence of the United States has been pretty strong. I think it's interesting that we're soon starting a presidency where the president-elect says, he will see that the two big conflicts end right away, that he is going to be a president of peace, and ironically, or maybe not, somehow is going to manage to do so by being rather bellicose in his rhetoric and his unpredictability. A lot of potential challenges to thinking out there. Perhaps some opportunities as well, but those opportunities are only going to be realized, I think, getting back to what Mark said in the first place, is there needs to be a degree of stability in policies. There needs to be trust. And as Mark pointed out, there needs to be a relationship established so that conversations can take place.
It's a little tacky at answering your own question, probably, but I have to. It seems to me we don't have any of those three things you listed, and that's one of the challenges. However, I'm interested to see if there's a Nixon moment possibility, which might happen in the context of maybe Netanyahu will have a gift for our president-elect in terms of kind of actually stepping forward and maybe ceasing or desisting to a certain degree. So I'm interested to see what happens in that regard. I think that this is a perfect opportunity for us to really, us as a people, to think about what we want our role to be in the world. I don't think we really engaged in that discussion after 9/11. I think it's led to a lot of folks in our country being, the forever wars come to mind, and so we have a domestic challenge. We're a very divided country, so our domestic politics very much affect our ability to be that actor, that mediator, I will say one thing: it is nice to be through the election cycle because there was no incentive. There is no incentive to deal with, where those disputes are, to think of the United States to have a role, I think, as a mediator. You need to have, a lame duck president just doesn't have a lot of opportunities. So it'll be interesting to watch, I think, the January and February and see what happens. Anne, did you think of a question you wanted to?
I have many. But I know that
we're going to do a couple of questions and we're going to throw it out.
Yeah,
after this
absolutely.
question.
So speaking of the influence, the growing influence of both China and Russia, I know we have seen, in addition to some of the countries you mentioned, Russia is building roads, giving foreign aid and so on to some of our partners who have been longtime allies, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa and North Africa. And so understanding that there may be a bellwether moment in the early part of next year with respect to the conflict with Russia's aggression towards Ukraine, I wonder, is that a bell that gets unrung or in any way, shape, or form mediated by U.S. influence?
make sure I'm clear.
Russia spent a lot of money.
Russia's money in Africa. That's an interesting
Russia's
one.
got a lot of money.
Yeah, it's playing a kind of a spoiler role in a lot of different ways. It's had its forces in Central African Republic going after the gold mines there. It's been invited into the Sahel, into Mali and Niger, and you probably know a lot more about this, Burkina as well. What had more or less been democratically elected governments at one time in Niger and in Mali have now been overthrown and are led by military strongmen. And they've kicked the French out, the longtime patrons of that region, though the French have been very, very much in the game fighting the Islamic terrorists in that region. The new governments in Mali and Niger now have invited the Russians in. The Russians are using very, very heavy-handed tactics to go after the terrorist groups in those countries. There's a lot of blowback apparently. I mean, they're taking such heavy-handed tactics that there's a kind of a popular blowback. So I've been hearing and reading about. I mean, I can very well see Russia overextending itself, overreaching. And as I can see China overreaching in some ways in China, and there being a popular reaction against that. So those are my thoughts.
Yeah, I agree with all of them. I think the role of Russia in the Sahel in particular is very negative, and it's something that nobody in the United States is paying much attention to, but probably should. It's pretty much ungoverned space now from, Chad is still the one hope, ironically, that we have of a country that we can do with. But it's not just the French that have been expelled. The United States has pretty much been expelled as well. We lost the Air Force Base in Niamey in Niger, but we lost the very important $100 million facility that we put in Agadez, which was really important because it was the eyes that projected from everything in Africa, from the equator up and into the southern Mediterranean as well. And that happened because of some, I would say, it's nice to be retired to say what you want to say. I would say from really, really poor mediation and diplomacy on our part. I mean, we were basically just told you can leave now in Niger because of a heavy-handed approach that we took, saying you can't talk to Russia, you can't do anything with Iran. We want to stay here, and we were told, well, you're not going to stay here, and thank you very much. Again, getting back, that's not what a mediator does. That's what somebody that comes in a little bit strongly. There is blowback, I think, in China, against China in Africa. There is now a growing perception that what seemed to be beneficial to many African countries is not very beneficial to most African people, just the governments that are charged, and very definitely very advantageous to China. So a bit of blowback there. Yeah, I agree Russia's going to overextend because at a certain point it's not going to be able to deliver even with really human rights abusive tactics against the terrorist threat that is very, very real in countries across northern Africa now. And they don't have the money to continue paying off governments. China does, but it's going to need to do a slightly better job than what it's doing now.
I just want to pick up on your theme, Tom, Mark, about China and the China threat. It seems to me that we wrote a piece together, actually, right after you were here on campus. And at that time, we were talking about strategic engagement and the importance of the United States to engage with China. It almost feels like a different time, doesn't it? And I would just say that to the point that you have both made is that I think sometimes, I think China is an illustration of what a difficult challenge it is for the United States. We are used to being able to control things a little bit more than I think we have the capability to do. And I don't think we're very good at nuance. And the challenge of China is that they are simultaneously an adversary in many ways and simultaneously an essential partner in other areas. And it's that balance that we need to figure out, I think, in order to be successful in our foreign policy goals. And and this is maybe the hangover of being a superpower, is that you have an overinflated idea of what you can accomplish, and maybe the 20 years of forever wars and some of the kind of the lessons from that kind of demonstrated. But I think we have our psyche about our role in the world, and then we have some of the reality that's a little bit of a bitter pill. And I think learning how to actually engage in mediation again, when we've had 15 years, it's not quite retrenchment, but stepping back. It predates President Trump, the first president, his first administration, by at least one administration. He's a manifestation, his policies are a manifestation of a pattern here. And so I think it reminds me of, frankly, I'm not saying we're in decline per se, but it reminds me of how it took Britain 50 years to rethink its role as well. And it's tough. And the devil's in the details on that. And I didn't pose that as a question to the group. I actually think we should open it up. But we live in interesting times, I'd say.
Can I ask one more question?
Okay.
Madam Chair.
Yeah, sure. Okay. Maybe we'll have brief answers and then we'll open it up.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think both of you have had, and Mark, I know in particular, we're here talking about the various mediations that you've done, and I know that not every mediation is successful, as you've pointed out. And how does the diplomat in you sort of move forward after potentially something like the situations you faced over the course of your time in, for example, Chad? What does the mediator do to pick himself up and move forward to have that sense that I am a trusted partner, and I want to continue to try to make a difference, even if in this case I could not, or the deal fell apart.
Well, one thing you have to understand is it's never over. You know, what is that line from a Faulkner novel? History isn't the past; it's not even over yet, or something. So yeah, it's Here's another phrase that I keep in mind. It's attributed to various people. George Shultz, I think, would refer to it. Diplomacy it's tending a garden, and the weeds are always going to be growing. It always needs to be watered and looked after. You're never going to solve a problem and have a final agreement and be done with it and then go on to something else in dealing with the affairs of the world. You just got to keep working at it. And you might think you've solved it, but it's going to rear its head in another way. I mean, many countries they're still wrestling with conflicts that they've had for many, many centuries. I mean, as I say, history just keeps rolling forward, and diplomats are there to try to manage it as best they can, keep things from spiraling out of control. Any thoughts?
Maybe just one, and then let's open it to questions. Getting back, the relationships piece is really important, as Mark pointed out. I mean, it wasn't just, you think about it. Kissinger in the 1970s, was hugely instrumental in, changing U.S. foreign policy, in ending a war in the Middle East. least, by putting his foot down on certain issues, but without selling out important partners as well. To the point where just months before he died, at 100 years old, he flew to China and had a long chat with President Xi. We don't probably have enough of that at that level now. Important that there be that relationship, important that we remember that those diplomatic communications are really important. Important that we remember for those to take place, we can't cede our foreign policy to the National Security Council, nor to the Department of Defense, which doesn't really want it anyhow. But those relationships and the tending of the garden are probably key.
The floor is open for questions. Yes.
So first of all, thank you for speaking to us. Earlier, it was stressed the importance of bringing everyone that's involved to the table. Yet many times, the people involved are violent extremist groups that use terrorism, criminal syndicates in case of Haiti, or even paramilitary forces. And yet you always hear that the United States does not negotiate with terrorists. And so I was wondering, as mediators, how do you walk that very delicate legal line that you're constrained by, while also making sure you're working towards a peace that truly everyone has a stake in?
That's a hard one to answer, but I'll take a stab at it. Not every conflict can be mediated, and conflicts involving violent terrorists are not conflicts that I think are amenable to that kind of mediation. So, sometimes force is required to deal with some situations, while also keeping an eye on dealing with the conditions that give rise to violent extremism. I'm not sure there's much point in trying to negotiate with Al-Qaeda in the Sahel or drug cartels in Mexico. Maybe there needs to be more attention paid to dealing with the roots of conflicts and the social conditions that give rise to conflicts in places like Mali and Niger. Now that's far easier said than done. I mean, I'm not sure that we or anybody has the resources to go in and fix these kinds of problems, but nonetheless, maybe there needs to be more attention paid to the non-military ways that you can address some of the root conditions to violence, while also at the same time being firm and dealing with the manifestations of violent extremism.
And maybe just adding on to that, there are times where there are ways to have conversations. They're just at a lower level. I mean, a good example was Ryan Crocker went to Iran at the very beginning of the time that the Afghan, our embassy in Afghan was stood up. Wasn't widely known, but there was some common ground there, so it may not be at a high level. Sometimes the other thing you want to do is just, there's where a third country can be really very important. You're not speaking with the terrorists, but Qatar is, and you're speaking with Qatar, and there's a cut out there. There are also, other channels, sometimes intel channels, that make certain possibilities realistic. And last but not least, when there is some movement, sometimes yesterday's terrorists can be today's freedom fighters, if you're ready to make that leap and spin it accordingly. But usually, that's where I think third parties can be really, really influential, really important.
I think there was a question over here somewhere. Okay, yes.
Yeah,
Waiting for the mic.
if our role is changing as negotiator in the world view, how does the role of the U.S. dollar, does that play into that too? It seems like there's some erosion in that as well.
Stab at that as well. frankly, I'm not sure there has been much erosion in the role of the dollar.
Good to hear.
The dollar is still the reserve currency of choice in all the major treasuries around the world, including China. It may have lowered it to some extent. They're moving more into gold, I think, but there hasn't been a kind of a selling of dollar assets, and it's kind of surprising in a way. I mean, because the U.S. is still a dominant economic player in the world. It's not like it used to be, though. But still, the dollar is, it's the currency that most international trade is done in, and it's the reserve currency, as I say. China with the so-called BRICS, some of the key countries in the global south, they're working on developing some kind of payment scheme where they settle their accounts in currencies other than the dollar, but we'll see where that goes, if anywhere. You'd think that as the U.S. weaponizes the dollar and imposes sanctions on people all over the world we don't like, that's going to encourage people to look for other ways of other currencies to rely on. But so far, from what I understand, it really hasn't happened.
Thanks.
I'll toss out there that even when we cause a crisis in the financial markets, we tend to be the flight to safety. So during the 2008 financial crisis, we caused it, but most international capital flows came towards us because the dollar is still seen as a reserve currency.
Another question.
Yes.
Is it on?
Yeah, it's on, just speak into it.
Okay, I have a question for both Mark and Tom. Based on your mediation experience around the world, are there any regions or countries where it was easier to get stakeholders to the common ground or higher ground? If so, what were the issues at stake?
Where it was easier, you say?
Yes.
In so many of the places where I worked, it was pretty easy to find stakeholders to work with us. In Chad, the people of Chad would have welcomed us to have even a very strong role in the country. A very supportive economic role and a very supportive role encouraging the regime to open itself up and be more open to democratic change. A lot of reservoir of goodwill among the people in Taiwan for the United States, a reservoir of goodwill for the people in Japan for the United States. So I was very lucky in working in places that, for the most part, it was very easy to find partners throughout the country to work with. In some ways, even in China. I mean, that was a long time ago. The nationalism and the rhetoric wasn't then what it is now, but it was very easy to work with my Chinese counterparts, even if our policies didn't necessarily line up. So, what's your experience, Tom?
Yeah, I kind of agree with that. Well, Africa is a good example where for a long period of time, and still in many places, it's easier for the United States. There isn't the colonial baggage, and sometimes it's actually easier for the United States when it's going it alone, which is always a little bit tricky because the EU, the French, the UK want to be involved in issues in countries where they've been a dominant power for a long time. But the non-colonial past was and can still be helpful if you don't have those ties there. But again, there needs to be the trust that you're an honest mediator, that you're not trying to preserve a status quo that favors you, and that's why you're doing mediation.
Thank you. Thank you to the Center of Global Studies for putting on this great event. And Ambassador Wall, I actually had the pleasure of being in your class when you were here. Yeah. Hi, nice to see you again. Great to have you back on campus. But no, appreciate both your insights and just sharing your experiences. And I think there's so much that a mediator has to factor in, but that I'd love for each of you to paint a picture, certainly what you were describing, the dinner with the chip discussions, but what's the role of a mediator and the homework a mediator has to do for warming relations and having the conversations flow so that you can actually fill in the gaps between the wine and the vodka, or maybe in places where religiously alcohol is off the table. So what's the role of a mediator in having pleasant conversations, being a conversationalist, and what was the homework you do to prepare for those moments?
Well, receptions and meals it's not everything that mediation is about. It's just sort of it complements it. I mean, a lot of formal sessions involve two sides sitting across the table and throwing talking points at each other. They don't really get anywhere. The meals and the like kind of helps warm up the atmosphere, but that's not where the deals are necessarily made. The deals are typically made, in my experience, when the lead person on each side or the various sides get together in a side room and they kind of figure it out. So that may have been lubricated by some of these social occasions. I mean, there's in Kissinger's book on China, he talks about how China uses hospitality as an instrument of diplomacy. So China's very aware of this, but it is a part of it. But it's not. It's certainly not. It's not what it's all about. It's not where the deals actually have to be cut among the principal players in a negotiation.
Sidelines. It's called the sidelines.
I would agree with that. The negotiations and the mediations themselves sometimes are theater. It's important theater. It has to be there. But I think the role of a good mediator is a party that really can listen and intuit what is a satisfactory resolution for both sides. What really is the minimum that they need, because those conditions and stipulations aren't going to come up in the theatrical part of the mediation. So probably the ability to listen very, very carefully and read what's not written, because it's between the lines on both parts.
One more question, maybe?
So playing off of the previous question, then, did you do your homework with each individual side, listening and parroting back what you think you understand are the minimum points, or was that done in real time during the discussions?
Well, for me, it happened over time, cumulatively over time. You talk with people time and time again. You hear them out. You begin to understand each other. You build up trust, and then it starts to become much clearer to you, and you start to understand each other. And it's on that basis that you can eventually, if things work out, move towards some kind of agreement.
And then when you see really good negotiators or mediators, I mean, there's a certain point where they emerge and somehow conditions get set that bring the parties closer together. So in answer to your question, yeah, both. You do your homework in advance, and it does very definitely evolve. I mean, we talked about Madeleine Albright and Ranvier, but an example that Mark had mentioned, Richard Holbrook, was a very good mediator, and he wasn't a very good mediator because he was a warm and fuzzy, pleasant guy to be around when it came time to make decisions. I mean, with former Yugoslavia, he brought everybody into Ohio at Wright Air Force Base and kind of wouldn't let them out. It was a lot less attractive than the chateau. But he'd done his homework and he basically knew, and it usually was very helpful to the parties by saying, no, we're going to come to a resolution. You can live with this, correct? You can live with that, and then move to that.
I wanted to ask both of you, do you have any final thoughts? Anything you want to, either Mark or Tom?
Well, I feel like I'm talking about a bygone world when I talk about my experiences, because I kind of feel like we're moving into another era in our approach to the world. We seem to be moving in this new administration into a world not based on alliances and working with our partners to solve our problems, openness to trade and ideas. We seem to be moving toward, well, it's phrased as America first, more isolationism, more nationalism, more protectionism. I'm all for America first too, but to my mind, putting America first is served by working with our allies and being open to trade, but that's kind of not where we're going. But anyway, it's a new world we're moving into, so it's going to be very interesting how all this plays out.
All right, I want to say thank you to the Center for Global Studies for hosting this, and please help me thank our panel.